Yeah, woo. Most everybody's already found the food, but if you haven't, there's still a couple pizzas. There's still some salad. There's drinks up here. So yeah, do that. Be careful with the ranch if it has a squeezy top on it. There's been a couple casualties already. None on the carpet this month, though, so that's a plus. And then if at any time you need to use the restroom, there's a couple single-person restrooms right on the other side of this wall, kind of down a little hallway to the left. And then back towards the elevators, there's restrooms as well. I would like to thank our sponsors tonight. First is Turing for letting us use this meeting space, Salt Lending, who sponsors our meetup fees, and Waterbear, who's our main sponsor for the event tonight. One of our speakers is from Waterbear, and he'll be talking a little bit more about them and what they do when he comes up for his talk. Yeah, thanks to them. Now I'd like to introduce Mr. Will Klein, one of our co-organizers, who's going to talk about a couple things about the meetup.
Cool. So we have an open collective now. This was started back in. Oh, there's a camera thing. This was started back in November. We had a shortfall in November, so we let everyone know in December, and a bunch of people donated. It's been phenomenal. So this meetup is also sponsored by all of you because the community's been fantastic and has totally stepped up. We're like just very close to hitting our shortfall for November. So if you want to make a donation, we are hosted on the Open Collective 501c3. Did I say that right? It's nonprofit and tax deductible and all that. And the other cool thing about Open Collective is all of our donations go up there. You're featured as a backer, kind of like the way Kickstarter does it, but this is like more open source and open organization oriented. And so you're featured as a backer. Your company can be featured as a backer. Tonight's sponsor, Waterbear, is our first company sponsor for Meetup, which is phenomenal through Open Collective. So we're really happy to have that. And also all of our expenses and all of our budget and everything that we do to operate this meetup is on there. So we found this is a really good way to be transparent, to share what we're doing, and to make this more of a community-driven event. With that, we have some announcements. And the first announcement that I want to share is Global Diversity CFP Day. So for those of you that don't know, CFP stands for Call for Proposal. So when conferences want to hear from speakers that they don't know, that they've never heard of, they put out a call for proposals. And this is where any of us can say, I have an idea for a talk, and submit that idea. And then conferences do their best to select a variety of talks and build their lineup from there. I've gotten into a few conferences through CFPs. They're fantastic. And what Global Diversity CFP Day is an effort to bring more diverse voices to the conference scene. So it's for anyone that identifies with an underrepresented or marginalized group in tech. Women, people of color, the LGBTI community, and also people with mental and physical disabilities. So if you know someone that identifies with that group and would like to encourage, if you would like to, or if you'd like to encourage someone else to give this a shot, getting into conference speaking, please tell them about this event. There's one being hosted here in Colorado right now in Boulder at Workday. This will be Saturday, March 2nd. It's free to attend. It's also free to mentor. If you've given a conference talk and you'd like to come out and support others that are new to this, we're looking for you to join our team to put this event on. And if there's enough interest, we'll put on a Denver workshop as well. I can use help on the organizing side for that if anyone wants to spearhead that. Are there any other community announcements? Okay, I'll hand it back.
Thanks, Will. So next up, who's hiring? We've got a couple people up here on the board. I would like these people to come up here and talk about a little bit about the positions. Also, if you didn't have a chance to put it up here yet, please, you can come up and talk too, and then please write it up on the board afterwards because we tweet this out so that people can, if you didn't write the email down or whatever. So, Gabby, you want to talk about EchoBind really quick? on the spot. Will you come over here?
Hello, I'm Gabby. I work for Ecovine on the React Native / mobile team. We're an agency based out of Boston, but everyone on the team is fully remote. So it's a remote first team, all that. We are looking for more React Native developers. Currently, we're working with an Elixir backend on most projects, but we've just got a lot more projects coming in that are wanting mobile applications. So I think anything from junior, mid, senior experience is okay. They haven't really told me anything different. So but yeah, we're a pretty small team right now. I think we're, maybe about 8 developers strong, and working on a lot of healthcare apps. I don't think that's by choice, it's just kind of fallen into that. But yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. I left my Twitter handle up there. I'm on Denver Dev Slack all the time because I am lonely in my house all alone. Or I am here for the rest of the evening. Feel free to come talk to me.
Thanks. Is Brian here from FusionAuth? Can you guys kind of stack up after him? So Jason and somebody from Manifold and somebody from Formidable. There you go.
I'll go fast. I don't have as great a story as she does to tell. We're FusionAuth.io, identity access management, user management platform. We're looking for dev advocates and writers and senior developers. So if you do anything like that, we're looking for people to do those things. So our Twitter handle's up there. My name's up there. I'm here. So look for me with this shirt on.
Thanks.
We are located right up the street from here. So like 16th and Welton.
I'm getting the hang of this. I'm Jason Waldrop with GigSmart. We are a gig economy platform servicing workers and employers. On demand, we just launched in November, getting about 200 signups a day, 1,000 a week. We're hiring like crazy, so looking for Elixir developers on the back end, and then React Native on the front end. So GraphQL, Elixir, Relay, some really cool tech. So if you're interested, jobs.gigsmart.com, or come find me. I'll be here for the evening. Oh, we're located here in Denver, and the WeWork in Lohi.
I have to get up and speak. Jeez. Hey, I'm Drew. I work at Manifold. We're an independent cloud services marketplace, so we're obsessed with like how developers work and how to like push that forward in the future. Like all the pain points of like how developing the cloud is hard. We're trying to solve. It's super ambitious, but we have a great team. So we're full remote. I'm the only Denver person right now. We have people in San Francisco and New York, and we get together a couple times a year. Anyways, we're hiring junior and senior React devs. We have a React front end, Go microservice back end. We also hiring Go devs. Yeah, you can check us out at manifold.co.
So hello, my name is Kylie. I'm from Formidable Labs. We are a Seattle-based JavaScript consultancy, but we do have an office here in Denver officially. So we are a team of 7 now, and we are looking to add a junior engineer to our team. We work in a modern JavaScript stack. Mid and senior level, we're kind of always hiring, and that can be remote focused. Just want to make that clear. But for the junior engineer position, it does need to be here. We actually meet at the Dairy Block. We have a spot in the co-working space, and then modern JavaScript stack, so GraphQL, Node, React, React Native, and that's it.
Thanks, Kylie. Anybody else hiring? Cool, thanks. Good question, by the way, on where are they located. That is important, yeah, I agree. All right, so for our first talk tonight, we'll have functional full stack, getting real time with React, Redux, and Elixir. And that will be presented by Joey. I'm not going to try to butcher your last name. So Joey, come on down.
Check, check. Over the ears? Is this check? Mic check? Cool. Alrighty, am I good to go? Cool. Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm Joey. I'm the founding partner at WaterBear Software. Quick blurb about us. For those that don't know, WaterBear is a colloquial name for tardigrade, which is one of the most indestructible creatures on the planet, so the only animal that survived the vacuum of space. And one of our focuses is building long-lasting apps that make a difference in the real world, and really fault-tolerant applications. The main reason I wanted to give a talk is so we can get involved in the local Denver community. So a few facts about me if you want to reach out to me afterwards or use these as starting points. My first paid gig programming was in the awesome stack of Visual Basic 10 years ago, which is super fun. Took the traditional route then by getting a creative writing degree. And I went to one of the original dev boot camps. So those were the boot camps way back when that kind of spawned the technical school and boot camp craze of the day, and it was an awesome experience. I have 5 years of production professional experience in both Elixir and React, so pre-prod for both libraries. And before that, I programmed professionally in Ruby, Python, and Angular 1.0, which was a nightmare. And finally, again about WaterBear, so we do full product lifecycle consulting, new product development, from discovery to hyperscaling, but we also offer traditional consulting services in terms of team boosts, architectural reviews, etc. I wanted to give this talk originally as a live coding exercise and realized that I would need a lot more time to do that. So I'll take a poll at the end, and if people are interested, we might set up a workshop in the future with the React meetup. Instead, I'm going to take some production code and we're going to break that apart. So just to be clear, since this is my first time giving this talk is not an argument that everybody should be a full stack developer, or even that deep generalist engineers are more valuable in some way than experts. To build good products, we need both. But what this talk is meant to be is it's meant to explore how almost any software team can benefit from a full stack developer, and especially deep generalist engineers. I'm going to show a concrete path and tool chain for people that are aspiring to it that can take you there, and hopefully leave you guys with a broader set of principles that can be applied to any tool chain or stack you find yourself in. And it's a pretty broad talk, so feel free to raise your hand, ask questions, etc. if the dots aren't connecting. Okay, so start with a quick definition. So at WaterBear, most of us are deep generalist engineers. And for us, that means basically we have competencies in a broad number of computer science disciplines. And I think a question that gets skipped over a lot is, what is competency? And my favorite sort of definition, which is from a Stanford professor, is that it means your polymath activities have passed a level within which you can work within a field in competition effectively. So you have competency in an area of CS if you can work on a team of experts and not sort of mess up what they're doing and be effective with them. Okay, so I think the reason I'm giving the talk is becoming a deep generalist is really, really hard. There are dozens of vast disciplines in computer science that are largely unrelated. So everything from UI, UX, databases, concurrency, cryptography, et cetera, et cetera. And I put a bunch of bubbles on the slide. This isn't all of them. And the reality is each one of these bubbles has lots of subsets of industries underneath it. You can't go be an expert in just cryptography today. If you get a PhD, you're going to get a PhD in a subset of a subset of a subset of cryptography. So attempting to aspire to be competent in any of these is a challenge. and we want to talk about being competent in multiple. So there's brain explosion. How do we link these together? Okay, and also, we're going to show competency because we're going to be talking about a production application, and this is one we just built at WaterBear, and we'll break down the code behind one of the features. This is it right here. So this is a live geospatial dashboard for a farming application we built. So this is an Indian reservation that we're looking at. They grow potatoes and different kinds of produce. This is built with React, an Elixir backend. The entire application is soft real time. So it's all this data is synced over WebSockets. The reason I think this demonstrates competency is, well, so this was built over a couple months by 2 engineers. Where's Nat? Raise your hand. Nat's back there. So in terms of competency, this is actually designed mobile first because it's used in the farm and the field. So everything sort of collapses and is interactive with each other from the smallest iPhone platform. In terms of UX competency, this is used in rural areas. So there's a lot of connectivity UX behind it in terms of how good is your internet connection, what are your speeds, how does that impact what you're looking at on the app. In the middle of the stack, like I said, everything's soft real time in the entire application. On the back end of the stack is a distributed data pipeline that processes millions of location points a day. All the data on this dashboard is inferred, so there's no user anywhere saying, I'm doing this. So it's a pretty complex back end, supervised process architecture, distributed nodes, and it's built with a first-class continuous delivery pipeline. So we have one click, build, analyze, test, deploy for development. And Nat has touched literally every single one of those things. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about real competency in them. Okay, so I think being a deep generalist is difficult, but this is why it's so valuable. Any software product we build requires charting a course through these disciplines. Not all of them, but certainly a lot. If it's a web product, you're for sure going to have markup and CSS for styling. You're probably for sure going to be thinking about a database, et cetera. You always have to be thinking about security, and with the cloud, a lot more about networking. So I think deep generalists basically add this to a team. You have the ability to move quickly and flexibly during an implementation. So if what you thought was going to be the hard part of a project was the client, and that turns out to be straightforward, but you're having issues optimizing your database, a deep generalist can sort of switch between domains on the team. A deep generalist can perceive how decisions made by a specialist impact others. So what it means by deciding to adapt a GraphQL API on the back end or provisioning a database in some particular way. And I think this is the most understated value proposition of a full stack developer because they operate broadly. They often have a good sense for knowing what they don't know. So in the case of the application we'll work through, Nat actually designed it. It's meant for a B2B application. If it was a consumer app, then Nat probably would have raised her hand and said, look, I like design, I've done it for a while, I have a competency here, but we should invest in a team of designers if this is going out to millions of people, because that's a different level of depth. Okay, so I think the stack itself helps a ton. By the time we've built multiple production applications with React, Redux, and Elixir, you're going to sort of necessarily be good at a bunch of diverse things. The DevOps side, UI, UX side, you'll probably have worked through a half a dozen concurrency models. You might be doing some real parallelism with the Erlang scheduler, and if you're scaling the app, then you're talking distributed systems. So working through this stack over and over again helps you become a full stack developer, but it's not enough. The reason it's not enough is that these are all hard to learn, and if you spend too much time in one of them, you'll start to lose your skill sets in the others. So in the case of this application, we have a clear strategy for horizontal scaling. If we had to go to hundreds of millions or billions of location points a day, it would be a couple months of engineering on it. By that time, we might have forgotten all about the original connectivity UX we were working with. So the stack helps, it's not enough. And the rest of this talk is going to be about how we apply mental models to take all these disciplines and make them easier to traverse as engineers. So the first mental model that we adopt through all of our applications is functional programming. And the basis of functional, actually, can I get a raise of hands who's done functional programming or is familiar with it? Cool, okay, a bunch of people. The basic idea is that computation is the evaluation of mathematical methods. So this is actually super different than I'd say like the modern variants of object-oriented programming. In that data is always immutable. So what you say, what something is that, and it will never change. Everything is immutable, and then functions constantly change the data we're working with without producing side effects. They're pure functions. And you might have heard of this in Redux a little bit. But when you have these two things together, the world is a lot easier to reason about, and we'll talk about why in a second. And I think functional programming is so important because it doesn't matter if you are trying to reflect state in a React component or you're serializing I/O in an embedded device. Wherever you're at in the stack, all programming is taking data in, doing something with it, and spitting new data out. I did kind of just want to highlight like a funny thing. We're sort of taught in school, like from a young age, how math works. And we can do things like say 10 equals a plus 1 and solve for a. And programming changes what the equal sign means for us, and it changes what some of these expressions mean in a way that can be really hard to reason with. In Elixir, this would be a valid line of code, the 10 equals a plus 1. And this would actually evaluate to true if a was 9. So you're sort of working with data in a way that you've been taught to and trained to from elementary school, middle school, and later on. Here's a caveat to that. In today's JavaScript, with React, on the client where you're talking about one tab and sort of one memory, mutability isn't the absolute worst. It can be, if anyone ever did two-way binding with Angular 1, then it is the worst. And if you're working with multiple computational processes, it is also the worst. But we still get benefits from immutability in JavaScript, even with React. The first is no cognitive overhead. So in JavaScript, by default, different kinds of data play by different rules. So strings are immutable by default, numbers are immutable by default, arrays are not, they're mutable, maps and objects are mutable, and you have to remember which is which when you work with them. But not true if you treat everything as immutable. And the second is super awesome optimization. So for basically, if everything's immutable, React doesn't have to compare massive object trees for equality and say, are these things equal to each other? Because if they're equal, then they're referring to the same sort of value. And so all they have to do is check the references. And if the references aren't true, then they know they're equal or not. So you get really awesome optimizations from immutability. Second thing that we'll go through in the code is the actor model. So who's familiar with the actor model of concurrency? Okay, basic idea here is that the smallest units of computation maintain their own state. Nobody else gets to see that. And the only way people can read from or request changes to that is through message passing. I think it's super important if you're going to be a deep generalist to always design code concurrency first, because everything in the real world is concurrent. So as soon as you have an only synchronous program, you are breaking from the way the real world works. Okay, so I also think actor model is universally applicable and, for a couple reasons. It's how humans learn about things. Like update our state, think about the world outside of us. It's all message passing. We've been doing it for 100,000 years. And the only way we can learn is some kind of message. It might be optical with our eyes, it might be verbal, it might be online, etc. But it's a very natural way to think. I actually think it's super funny because some of the originators of the actor model say that the idea came from quantum physics, which is super funny because I'm like, this is just what humans do. It's not that crazy. So here's the premise, and we'll see this in the code. The premise is the stack has helped us work through a bunch of different computer science disciplines, but by streamlining the way we approach them, we can traverse them much more easily and simply. We can actually be functional full stack developers with the actor model and functional programming. The final way I'll put it, functional programming gives us a trained from youth methodology on how to design and build computational systems. The actor model gives us a physically and human natural way to think about how those systems interact with each other. This is why they can tie the disciplines together. Okay, so here we have, actually it's probably a few components, but an example from the application. This is a React component. When we look at the actual entire implementation stack, this is actor model and message passing all the way down. So basically, if somebody clicks on the component and that component wants to change state, we are sending a message by dispatching an action in Redux. Who's familiar with Redux? Okay, cool. I really think they're bad names because really an action is just a fancy name for a message, and dispatching is a fancy name for explaining that we're sending that message somewhere. At the intermediary stack, basically the way that JavaScript communicates with the server is all message passing over HTTP WebSockets. And we use some abstractions to help us there, but same exact thing. And then finally, when you're firmly in the back end, when we're getting data in from those mobile devices, basically we have different processes on the back end, and the only way they communicate with the rest of the system is, again, message passing. The only thing that's changing anywhere in the stack for us at WaterBear is the transport protocols, which are abstracted over with libraries anyway. So at the client, it's the JavaScript runtime, the React Redux library. Backend is the Erlang VM, and in between, WebSockets and channels. These are actual messages from the production app. The front one is client only, so that's a Redux constant with a payload and a type and a JavaScript object. The WebSocket is a JSON serializable object with an event type. That's basically the same thing but a string and a body. And on our server, because message passing is so integral to Elixir, you don't need the type key. It's just a get device atom with the payload. And I typoed the struct. It shouldn't be a user struct. But skip that. OK, so I didn't even pretty up this component for the display. This is actually from production code. But what I wanted to point out is that this component is read-only. It's essentially immutable. It only gets data through props. There's a couple of functions that do additional rendering inside of it. Those only take in data, use the state they have internal to the function, and produce it basically rendered in a slightly different way. So the whole React component is read-only and immutable at the tip of the stack. I mentioned this before, but Redux actions are just complicated descriptions of message passing. This is the actual action in here. The action creator is just to make it easy to make messages. It's just got the type and the payload of the message itself. And sort of the store and the reducer function as an inbox for those messages. They're listening via the case statement for different types of messages we're sending the store to request or update state. And the reducer uses, again, a concept from functional programming, a pure function to update the state. So it's only using basically arguments passed into the reducer, the state tree, and the new request. And finally, sort of another thing from functional programming, when we update the state tree in Redux, because state might be mutable in JavaScript, we're using an immutable operator, the ES6 operator, to ensure that we produce a copy, thereby keeping that data structure mutable as well. Okay, so that's basically what's happening on the client there. We have React tied to Redux, handling message passing back and forth. If we talk about what's going on in between the client and the server, it's going to be basically the exact same thing. So we have a user socket module that attaches an event handler to the channel, so it waits for messages coming in, telling it that the client needs to reflect some new state. In this case, a new piece of equipment showed up out in the field. And likewise, if the client needs to say, hey, I have something new, somebody added an operator or somebody added a field to this farm, I'm going to push that data, send a message saying new data added over the WebSocket. On the other side, we have basically the dashboard channel module in Elixir. Does almost the exact same thing. It has a handler, which waits for the same exact message types. It will get that new data and decide if it should save it or not. And it has what we call a client API. So since nobody's, like, a user would touch buttons in React to change the state, since code is what's doing the state changes, it's called a client API. They would call this function broadcast new worker. That will send the fact that we have a new equipment to show in that summary to everybody that's connected to the application. And I'll just bear you guys one last time. In the mental model that we use on the server, it is, again, message passing. It's turtles all the way down. This is one of the processes implemented on the back end in the data pipeline. And we can see, again, it follows the same client API to send messages, and it has a message handler, an inbox, like our Redux reducer, like our WebSocket bindings. In this case, if somebody wants to read state from our actor model, then they will basically send a message to it. It will look and see if it should respond to that message and what it wants to tell the person requesting the data. So that's basically the decomposition of the full stack there minus the database. I think it's worth mentioning that, like, this is in no way theoretical. So almost at every time in your life, you'll have to deal with some kind of system that breaks the guarantees of the actor model or of functional programming. A great example is Leaflet, which has its own rendering engine, and Leaflet itself is sort of this giant mutable state tree that fights with React. And in Erlang, you might need like a Rust program, a Python program, something on the side. We can use the same actor model pattern to isolate side effects from those things. So my favorite JavaScript library is called Redux Saga. We isolate Leaflet, and we have Leaflet send us messages safe, and then we deal with those safely in the React app. Use the same strategy. It's called Erlang ports on the Elixir side. You can even mimic the process architecture pretty much almost the exact same of Elixir supervision trees in Redux Saga, which is kind of cool. And finally, I think a couple things I just wanted to mention. The question when you're talking about different runtimes, so the back end and the front end, there's a question of state synchronization. So what I'm showing on the client, how well is that reflecting what's on the server? In most applications, and this one, like watching that network connection, and if the WebSocket fails, reloading state is sufficient. That's not always sufficient. You might lose things in the WebSocket, or timing might be way more crucial in the application than it is for a dashboard. And there's some advanced things we can do to get those closer. So we could jump into our different disciplines and go into cryptography and do state syncs with different hashing strategies, or use distributed systems and cryptography and use CRDTs, which are a special data type that takes into account the different reflections of state in the different runtimes. So this works, I'd say, in virtually every situation. Especially if you have Elixir or JavaScript at the core of your stack. Okay, yeah, that's my talk. Again, I apologize. I prefer to do workshop-y stuff. If anybody ever wanted to do like a free workshop where we built a live coded dashboard with React Redux and Elixir, could you raise your hand? Just see. Okay, sweet, cool. I think we'll work through the meetup organizers then to do that. Kind of maybe sometime in February. Plan it for like a 3-hour thing. This is my contact information if anybody's interested in reaching out. Again, we are looking to take on 1 or 2 more clients this spring for WaterBear. Also, we hire in network, so if any of you guys like this, then please reach out to us so we can meet you. And shameless plug, I'm doing a talk at the March Elixir and Erlang meetup called On the Golden Path, Production DevOps in Elixir. And we'll look at some of the awesome features there, like our continuous delivery pipeline, distributing nodes, hot swapping code in production for 0 downtime, and different kinds of telemetry on the back end. So if you want to see more about that stack, please come to that. Thanks.
So we're gonna do some Q&A real quick. So how this will work is if you have a question, if you wouldn't mind coming down here, and then I'll hand you a mic. That way we get you on the live stream and everybody can definitely hear you. I'm gonna start off with a question. Give us like 20 seconds about what Elixir is.
Yes, magic, the best backend stack ever. So who's heard of microservices? Cool. A whole bunch of people decided that microservices were cool, and distributed, sort of isolated services and distributed computation was a good thing. And so they all reinvented it. It's been around as Erlang for like 20 or 30 years. Elixir is a modern variant of, it's not just syntactic sugar, but it's kind of like a modern Erlang. So it's Ruby-inspired syntax. It has nice data types for developers to work with, like structs, and some additional tooling Erlang doesn't. But it's a backend framework that's fully functional programming and is a breeze to work with and awesome. So everyone should check it out.
Thank you. All right, first question.
So thanks for the awesome breakdown. I love magic. Can Elixir, because I was looking at doing something with like RabbitMQ or Kafka for some like pub subsystems, could I replace that with Elixir and doing WebSockets like you're doing?
Yeah, so I think RabbitMQ is Erlang based. Anybody here?
That's what I thought, yeah.
So it is, but that being said, I think it totally depends on your pub sub mechanism. Like Elixir by itself, you can do pub sub behavior with just basic Elixir processes if you want. There are some really cool libraries that help with pub sub. We've used Phoenix Presence a lot, so there's so many options. What's the use case, I guess?
Basically, working with a company that's in the health and fitness industry, and they're going to be doing like a live updating dashboard across potentially, hundreds of thousands of users. So,
yeah, I mean, I think they basically kind of like it's called OTP. It's like both a library and strategy set for how to program fault-tolerant applications in Elixir. But the process that we saw powering this is called a gen server. I really think for that use case, like standard vanilla Elixir and gen servers will take you there. So this runs, that's one client we're looking at, but this application runs in the cloud for tons and tons of equipment. And we have like exactly 0 performance issues, and it's really easy to reason about. So
gotcha. Does it play well with GraphQL?
Yes, there's an awesome GraphQL library for Elixir called Absinthe. There might be a couple others. That's one I'm familiar with.
Cool beans. Thanks, man.
You bet.
Thanks. I'll drag people more towards the middle over here. Sorry.
Could you comment on the soft real-time capabilities of the system and why your stack works well for that?
Yeah. So from a product imperative standpoint, farming is super chaotic and it's not planned really thoroughly, and so things are changing all the time. And so for this application to be valuable to users, they needed a glimpse of sort of what's been happening in the last 15 minutes, hour. This is within the last couple seconds. So that's why we built it that way. The other reason we did is because it's, I won't say trivially because I hate when people use trivial in computer science, but it is really straightforward and almost simple to build real-time apps with React and Elixir, which that workshop will show. Yeah, so I mean, in terms of capabilities, I mean, everything is communicated over the WebSocket, so everything is soft real-time. A lot of our API responses are sub-milliseconds, so we get readings in microseconds, which is funny. And in terms of scalability, right now we're running essentially all of the production companies on a 8 or 12 core machine. we could bump that up with no behavioral changes to 24 cores and keep the same performance for hundreds of new farms and distribute if we need to.
So are you getting sensor readings in real time and trying to represent those to users?
Yes, yes, yeah. It like the soft real time piece is a factor of the behavior of the farm environment. So those devices are in rural areas, so they can come in real time. So they could come in within less than a second of being sent over the network. They might be offline and come in never. So that's where a ton of the crazy UX behavior and connectivity behavior comes into play, but it handles both. Yeah.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. That's okay. We'll take these two questions, and then that's all we've got time for.
Sorry, actually not a question, but following up on Joey's shameless plug for the Elixir meetup, which is the first Monday of the month at the WeWork in Union Station. We address things like functional programming, the actor model, OTP, and the like. Thank you.
Can I answer yes to that?
Hey, so you mentioned you're doing your app's working in a lot of places where you have either offline connections or very slow connections. I'm wondering, like, both from a UI perspective and from a code perspective, how are you sort of measuring the status of those connections and communicating that to the user? Right,
that is a good question. There are a lot of strategies, and they all kind of suck. We've explored a lot of them. I wouldn't say ours is super great. I think we have a couple pieces of logic that attempt to speculate at the strength of the connection, and one that's just kind of sending health checks all the time. So the actual iconography there is based on that logic. I think the most important thing, regardless of like the code behind it, is does the user feel like they have a sense for the connectivity? So if the user feels like they understand what's going on, then the exact way you achieve that, I think, is sort of like an implementation detail. And I think the real problem is so many applications today assume high-speed internet connectivity. And so it's a user, for us, it's a user expectation thing. Yeah, in terms of like node distribution, like the back end, those processes are always sending health checks through the Erlang runtime, so it's kind of baked in there too.
Cool, thank you so much.
Sweet, thanks.
All right, we're going to take a short break. Restrooms, pizza, drinks. We will start our next talk in a little more than 5 minutes, right at 7 o'clock.
Why I'm here.
we had another job get added up here, and so we're gonna have a quick little intro about that, and then we'll. I've got one more announcement, and then we'll get on to our talk.
Thank you. My name's Bob Gilson. I'm the Director of App Development at Sequant.io. We're a cloud computing, numerical computing platform with a focus on the energy sector. We have customers that write substantial checks. We're funded for growth in the coming year. We're looking for some coding talent in JavaScript and C++. We also need an artist who knows Bootstrap, focus on artist, and we need a QA guy who knows XML. If any of this is interesting to you, we have the contact information here, and I'll be here at the end of the presentation to speak to anyone who's interested. Thank you for your time.
Thanks. One quick comment. During the first talk here, Will went and put links to slides and announcements that he had at the beginning, and all kinds of stuff like that is in the comments on the meetup post. So if you find us on Twitter, there's a link to it there. You go to reactdenver.com, there's a link to it there. So that way you can find that. You can find slides and resources and whatnot. So, and with that, I'm going to turn us over for React Hooks, Line, and Sinker with Hilary. Yeah. Or you can.
For a very big head. And I have a tiny head. All right. Cool. So this is React Hooks, Line, and Sinker. I like puns, if you can't tell. My name is Hilary, and I'm hilarious on the internet, again, with the puns. So tonight I'm going to be going over the next big thing in React, which is hooks. Before I start, I wanted to know who here has heard of hooks. So, like, almost everybody. And who here has already started experimenting with hooks? Not as much. Cool. That's good, because I definitely focus my talk more on those who haven't experimented. So in this talk, I'm going to go over the what, the why of hooks, some different types of hooks, the rules of hooks. There are only two. And then dive into an example app that I built both with current React APIs and then with the new Hooks API, and then share some of what I learned when I did that. And then I'm going to share some of what the community has already created, which is a ton. It's kind of amazing, to illustrate how hooks might be used in the future, as well as some places that are great for you to learn more. Okay. Cool. So what are hooks? Hooks are, or is, I'm not sure which, an API that was introduced in at ReactConf by Sophie Alpert and Dan Abramov. And it's currently in the RFC process, or request for comments process, meaning that it's being proposed as an addition to React, and it is not yet part of the standard API. But Facebook is using it in production, so. Yeah, that was the first point. So the Hooks API, in essence, allows you, or are a group of special functions that let you hook into React features that are already part of React, like state, lifecycle methods, or context within functional components as opposed to within class components. That's all it is. That's it. Simple as that. You got it, right, guys? Like, I can leave. So the API is available for experimentation in 6.7.0 alpha, and will most likely be available in some future official or stable version of React. And because the React core team has been asking, I'll reiterate, hooks are not part of stable React. Not part of stable React. So don't change all your class components to hooks. Just like this toilet seat, not stable. Not stable. Cool. So why hooks? Like, those features are all part of React. We already have class components. Like, we're good. Why would we want to have this as a thing? So this kind of has two parts. In my mind, the first is why, as a developer, like why would you or I want to use hooks? And then why is the React core team, why did they make this choice? And the answer to the second one is performance. Classes make React code harder to optimize. So that's why they're trying to move the community away from using classes. And then there's a lot of reasons why you or I as a developer would want to use hooks, and one of them is hooks lets you use React without classes. In order, in order to like get started with React as a beginning developer, you would need to know about JavaScript classes, about this, which is different from different languages implementations of this, which could be confusing to someone. You have to remember to bind the event handlers, which now you have arrow functions, or like you have to know I use arrow functions. Otherwise, I have to bind this. And on top of that, you have to understand when to use a class or when to use a function. So these are definitely not trivial at all. A lot of information to just get started in React. So that's why you would not want to use classes. So hooks lets you reuse stateful logic between components without changing your component's hierarchy. What does that mean? So how many times has anyone here written a functional component, you're super excited about it, and then you need to add state? And then you need to change it all over to a class component, and it's so annoying. So annoying. So that's one kind of, you need to do that because you need to use stateful logic within the function, but then also reusing that stateful logic, if you go into that, then you have higher order components and render props, and that's a whole other thing about when to use what and what to use it for and all of that. So that won't happen any longer. There will just be one implementation when you need to reuse state between components. You'll just use hooks. You won't have to figure out whether you use a higher order component or render props. And that then also means that you won't need to, I think this is kind of related to the last one, but you won't need to change any kind of component hierarchy when you add a hook. When you add a render prop or a higher order component, you then need to go and wrap whatever thing with that higher order component or with that render prop. You need to wrap the component or set of components that need to share the state with a whole other component, but not with hooks. Yeah. Okay, and then the last point is that hooks let you split one component into smaller functions based off what's related. So this it's kind of hard to explain this without seeing it, but basically like right now, if you have like data fetching, and then you're also updating the UI based off that data, and then you're also doing like some other thing, you have to do those things based off the lifecycle method usually. So when you want to load data onto the page immediately, you would put it in component did mount, and then if something updates later, now you need to manipulate that same piece of data in the component did update. Maybe you're doing stuff with state, and so you have this piece of data or this context in multiple different places, and you have to keep track of it in each of the places and when you're doing what in what place. So hooks is going to eliminate that. Yeah. So you kind of can group each concern by itself as opposed to having it all throughout your component. Okay. So types of hooks. I kind of group these into three. That there's no like official terminology between like, oh, these are basic hooks. They're all the same. These are just kind of like the basic ones are ones that you're probably going to use a lot. Those are like the core of hooks. And then I have additional, which are going to be ones that you probably won't use as frequently. And then the last one is custom hooks, which is awesome. But we'll go over that in a little bit. So just to go over each of these, Use state is used for internal state of a component. That's kind of going to be like your set state, and then also the piece of state. Use effect is going to deal with mutations or subscriptions, timers, loggings, any kind of side effect. And that is fired asynchronously after layout and paint, and then before any new renders. And then use context, if you've ever used context in React, then it's pretty much the same API. It's like tiny bit different. You don't pass the consumer, you just pass the context that you create with use context to use context. Oh, I didn't go over the rest of them, and now I need to go over. Okay, so use reducer works exactly like a Redux reducer, which is cool. Yeah. Use callback returns a memoized callback, which is great for passing callbacks to stuff like onClick or all of those things. When you have to have like, oh, I handle this state change and then I wrap it in a callback in order to pass it on click so it doesn't get called immediately when the page renders. You can use callback for that and it'll be memoized, which is cool. And then use memo returns a memoized value instead of a callback. Use layout effect is the same exact thing as use effect, except that it fires synchronously and after all of the DOM mutations, but before layout and paint. So that is, if you need to manipulate the DOM in any kind of way, you're going to use layout effect. Also of note with that one is it fires at the same time as component did mount and component did update do now. So if you are migrating from a class to a hook component, then you could use that to like minimize change. However, you should try to use effect instead of use layout effect. And then use refs and use imperative methods both have to do with refs, if you've ever used those. Cool. So the hook commandments, there are 2. Thou shalt only call hooks at the top level, and thou shalt only call hooks from other React functions, or from React functions. So the first one is kind of explanatory, or that one is not actually explanatory. The second one is kind of explanatory. Only call hooks from either a component or a custom hook. And then the second one is getting a lot of attention, or the first one. I confuse myself by mixing up the bullet points. So the first one, that you should only call hooks at the top level. It's getting a lot of, chatter about it. That's because hooks are essentially an array that's attached to a component. They're a linked list, but same difference. Think of hooks as each getting their own index, and that index is how React knows what state to change when you call the function that the hook provides. So if you change that index by making the order of the hooks inconsistent, then you risk unexpected behavior in regards to the setting of the state. So the function that has index 1 gets called, but you meant for it to change the state of index 0. Yeah. So if you call hooks inside loops, conditions, or nested functions, then you introduce a risk of inconsistent ordering. Yeah. And then the final thing I have on here is not a rule, but there's an ESLint plugin. So you could add it individually, or I think there should be, probably out by now, a corresponding Create React app if you're using that. And it would be, the rule for hooks would be in that. And if you are using Create React app, then you should use that as opposed to introducing the plugin on top of whatever that has. Okay, so now my code examples. It's gonna be hard to move in Vim from here, but I'll figure it out. Um, oh, yeah, I can switch it over to mirror. That's probably better. There we go. There we go. Okay, so on the right-hand side, yes. Okay, so on the right-hand side, we have the app with hooks, and then on the left-hand side, we have an app with the current React API. So I wrote the one with the current API first, and I made a decision to not use context, and then I swiftly undid that decision when I did hooks because I wanted to use context and see how that worked. So that's why I have 3 open on the right side and only 1 open on the left. Everything that happens on the one in the left happens in 2 separate contexts, a search context and a photo ID context, and then the app is the same except it has the provider, the 2 providers, a search provider, search provider and the photo ID provider. Okay, so let's pull up just the 2 contexts since that actually has the hooks in them. So on the left side, we have this .state, which we set search terms and photo ID to empty strings. We bind this to the handle search term and the handle set photo ID, and then we pass those 2 things to the components down below, the search bar and the photo information and this photo list. So that's that. So then on the right side, we have just the sorry. Yeah, it's okay. So on the right side of the screen, I was talking about the left side of the screen before. The right side of the screen, just in case this wasn't confusing enough, I decided to add another confusion of confusing right versus left. Okay, so on the right side, we have the component that uses hooks, and it is a context, and so we've got search term. We're dealing with search term here. Wait, what? Just look at your screen and tell us. Okay, it's on the left side. Oh, because you're facing me. Oh. I'm really smart, I swear, guys. I just don't know right from left. Cool. So, on the left side, we have useState, which is the hook. It is the state hook. And the first argument is the piece of state. And the second argument is the function that we can use to manipulate the state. So, don't do anything with them other than handle set search term and then pass that down to the provider. Cool. So very similar stuff with the photo ID context. The piece of state is photo ID, and the thing that will manipulate the state is set photo ID. Yeah. Any questions with that? Yes, I can do that. Is this good? More? I know, it doesn't switch the directions. My husband,
Easy,
everyone.
easy.
It's my husband. It's okay. He can make fun
okay.
of me. I also have problems with directions in the car. He's saying, yeah. Uh-huh. Yes. You can and you can. So the default value here is this empty string that's passed to the use state function. So this thing right here. So that's the default state. And then you can use, you can pass props, a prop to that instead of, so I could pass in anything. So I could pass in whatever prop.blah. And that would be your default value, yes. Yeah. And then, yeah, with Recompose, this basically replaces Recompose. Recompose uses higher order components to do what this is doing. Cool. So if there are no more questions about understanding this, then I'm going to move on to the next thing, which would be use effect. Photo. Okay, so API that we're all familiar with, I've got a component will mount where I load in some photos. I should also show you the app probably, which is here. This is what it looks like. It's just basically loads in photos from Unsplash. And then you can search for cats and it will show you cat pictures. And then you can get some information about the photo on the right-hand side, like downloads, views, and likes. Okay, so that's the app. So component will mount. I load in all of those photos that were displaying originally. Component did update. If I have a search term set, then I will search for a photo. Otherwise, I will just load in the photos like I did before. And then those get passed to map over those to go to a photo component. Cool. So now on the left-hand side, we've got use state. So we're setting state of photos. So line 33 and line 9, both dealing with the state of photos. And line 10 and 26 on the right-hand side, and then this is it with the state of handling set photos. For hooks, and then you can see here I'm using the use context, which will update whenever the search term updates for that context. It will re-render the component with that new value, whatever search term is. And then I have a use effect where if the search term value exists, then I search, and if it doesn't, then I just load in the photos. So this use effect is the use side effect kind of thing. You can do a lot of different things with this function. You pass it a function as the first argument, and that does whatever effect. And then as the second argument, you can optionally pass it an array of values, whatever values the function inside the use effect uses, and it will only update, it will only call the use effect when that term changes. So if you don't have that, then use effect will get called every re-render. Cool. So that's use effect. Does anybody have questions about use effect? Yes. Yeah, so that is, sure.
Is it working? Oh, there we go. I'm just going to repeat questions so that we have them for the stream. So the question was, what is the search context?
Yeah, so that is the context that we first looked at before. It uses the context API, if anybody's familiar with that. It basically, if you've ever used Redux, it's kind of like that. It creates a provider, and then you consume it, and how you consume it with the hooks API is this. Does that make sense? You could use React. All of this will work with all of the existing APIs with React. you can just, you decide, hey, I want to try it out. You can create, and you're creating a new component, you can use a functional component and use hooks, and it will work with everything that you've already got. You don't need to use any of these new things if you don't want to. And classes will still be within React indefinitely. So if you choose not to do this new stuff, then you can. Yeah.
And the question was, what does error handling look like with hooks?
Uh-huh. You think it would be something you implement on your own, which I actually, it's not in this code, I'll show it later. I made my own custom hook, which then handles that exact same thing. So it's do it yourself, I guess. You would handle it, you would handle error handling just like you would with any other function. So if this returned a promise, this is my own function that I've written, this unsplash API.search photo, so I could have a catch in there. And then what I end up doing in the custom hook is that I set error state, and then it uses it in the component. Yeah. Okay. So the last thing I wanted to show was just the use callback. So this is basically how that works. And this kind of works like use effect, where it gets a function for the first argument, and then as a second argument, it gets an array of whatever values you use in the function, and it will only create a new memoized version of this function when that ID changes. Yeah. No. So the question was, what does that what exactly do I mean by a memoized function? It means that it points to the same, anytime I reference this handle on click, it will point to the same version of the set photo info ID function. There is a equivalent hook, use memo, which would do the same thing with the value. Yes. So that one, all I do is call handle on click. Yeah. Okay, and then one last thing I wanted to show in the code is the custom hook, which is I think what a lot of people will end up doing. Like, I use state internal to components, obviously, but not a ton. So that would kind of be what we were previously looking at. But with the custom hooks thing, you can basically create your own abstractions of state logic. So we'll see what that looks like. Oop. Okay, so I'm just going to quit out of this one. Cool. So this is a custom hook. So it's just basically a function. And then I can use the hook things inside of that function. So at the top, I'm creating an error state, a loading state, and a data state. So this will work for all of the API calls that I use internal to the app. And you could abstract this out. I made this specifically for that Unsplash API, but you could abstract this out to work just for fetch. So then you would just use fetch and pass it a URL, and then instead of a type here, and then it would populate the data to your component. Yeah. So I use effect, and I basically say like what function I'm calling, which is the call to the API. I do some things with setting parameters. If there's no parameters, then I just return out of this function, and then I make an asynchronous call to get the data, and do all kinds of normal data stuff like calling JSON, and then the search photos returned a different API, so I had to call JSON.results on that one. And then I set data to response data. So this is setting this data attribute on line 35 to be whatever I get back from the API. If I get an error, then I'll set error to whatever the error is. And then same thing here. And then once the API call is finished, then I'll call set loading. And then I will return from this function the pieces of data, or the state, basically. And then, yeah, and then this is the same thing where it will only update when type or input update. So let's look at how this is used. Okay, so this is basically the example of error handling. So if I get an error from the API, I render an error component. While the API is getting the data, then I render a loading component. And then if it doesn't find any data at all, I call not found. And then once I get the data, I just return this, and that's what displays on the page. So this was pretty surprisingly easy to do, the custom component thing, and there's like a ton of stuff that you could do with this. Yeah. So does anybody have questions about the custom hook? I kind of messing up with your flow of having people.
That's okay.
I just want to make sure people understand.
I didn't tell you before either. It's fine.
I just want to make sure people understand before I go on to complicated things. But this is the most complicated thing. So does anybody have questions about that? Yes.
So the question was, does this replace some of the things from Redux? And if so, how does Redux work alongside hooks? Or why would you use this instead of hooks? Or instead of Redux, sorry.
I guess because you cannot use class components. Like, it's doing a lot of the same things, but it's doing it more in a more idiomatic React-y way, I think.
Can I tag on for a
Yeah.
sec? So a lot of that is still kind of getting figured out as people use this. That's a question I have as well of like, so where does Redux have a place in using React with hooks? I think a lot of that will get kind of clarified by, libraries that were like, does this library even matter anymore as things get closer to actually being released?
Sure. It's within a component. It's state within a component.
That's what I thought. So it seems like that sort of answers the question in a way, because you might be doing something more complex, but in the end, you're ending up with a peripheral state for your phone as opposed to Redux, which is accessible anywhere.
Yes. The idea is to like localize everything to the component, and basically, I think the idea with the people who are maintaining React and what they were thinking was that you kind of can potentially get rid of a lot of that stuff so that you have less things apart from React to manage, and that you can manage all of the things that you were doing with Redux with hooks eventually, not necessarily immediately. Like there is a use reducer, which you can use internal to a component state the same exact way as you would use a Redux reducer. But that state is not populated to the rest of your app unless you're using something like context.
There's a good chance that we'll probably end up seeing like a use Redux hook that then you can do like a map state within, and you would get the state from Redux in there, or same thing with dispatches. That's what a couple of the things I've read have said. But yeah, a lot of this is just kind of unknown so far, and that's why the big slide about this isn't stable yet.
Yeah, and that's also why they did. That's why they did a CFP, because there are people who maintain things like Redux and have to think about, okay, well, how is this going to work? Do I need to change what I'm doing based off this new API, especially because it's going to make it easier to optimize if I also encourage people to remove classes. You could not use classes with Redux as well, but yeah. So that's the code. The other thing that I wanted to go over quickly was my takeaways. So I thought that I wrote less code, which was cool. Like I was able to delete a lot of code. For example, with the use effect, like I could take things that are happening with the component did mount and also will mount or will update and kind of combine those into one. Also with the use state thing is like pretty simple. So yeah. I thought that it made me make better architectural decisions, or at least more idiomatic React decisions. It made me pull anything that was localized to a component into that component and keep it like very tight within that component, and then only share things that I needed to be shared, like the search term because it was used in 2 different components, or the photo ID, same thing, was used in 2 different components. Whereas before I actually wrote like a different version of the app and I was using like, it was just not as localized to the component. So then it ended up being harder to use hooks even. So then I like rewrote it and made it easier to use hooks. But yeah, I thought it made me write better code. It does take some getting used to. Like, it's definitely a shift of how you think about it, especially if you're using Redux and are used to having like that just global state on your app that you then connect into. Having everything very localized into the component is a shift. And then the last thing was custom hooks are really powerful. I had like 3 different functions that I didn't show, but the 3 different functions to integrate with the API, and then it basically compiled down to 1. So that was more like a refactor, but again, it made me make better architectural decisions. So, and then kind of touch on that. I think that it aligns with React thinking more than state and classes do, in that it forced me to localize everything into the component and make them these little pockets of state and UI. Yeah. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to show is just highlight all of these examples and other. Whoop, crap. Went too fast. Nope. Wait. Okay. So use hooks is, and they actually like are custom hooks, and I think you can subscribe to a newsletter, and you'll get one every like week or so. And then this nickgraph.github.io/react/reacthooks. That's a list of all of the hooks that people have already made as npm modules. It includes the core React ones, but it's amazing how much there already is. There's like use Apollo client, if any of you are using Apollo for GraphQL, which I thought was cool. Hooks by example is basically like, I think it's like 3 or 4 different example apps. They're working on dev tools, which would allow you to inspect components and then see what state or what effects or what context component is using. And then just touching again on the ESLint plugin. And then the last thing I was going to show is where to learn more, which is basically like where I learned everything. And there's a ton of stuff, even more than this. The official docs are really good. They're very, very explanatory. The RFC, which you could comment on if you wanted, if you had something to say. But specifically, Sebastian, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, but he made a comment that addresses a lot of the issues people were having, like needing to make sure that it's a consistent order, and why they did that. The next two are just blog posts that explain it. Why do React hooks rely on call order is that same exact thing. Why do they need a specific consistent order? And Dan Abramov explains that. And then there's already 2 Egghead IO classes, which I thought was crazy. Yeah. Any more questions?
All right,
Yes.
so now for questions, if we can have people head down to stage left over here. And then one thing I wanted to add real quick, if you don't mind. We talked about performance at the beginning, and performance is probably one of the favorite things in React that people like to bike shed, which for anybody that doesn't know what that means, that's just talking in circles about things that don't matter. Close enough. But so the performance gain that you get out of not having classes is actually when your JavaScript gets transpiled down to something that all browsers can understand. There's a really good example. I don't remember if it's a blog post or if it's in the talk from ReactConf. But there's an example of like what a transpiled function component looks like and what a transpiled class component looks like. And it's like 5 times more lines of code for a class component, which at the end of the day means 5 times more code that ends up getting shipped to your user's browser. So just a little background on where that performance is at. So Will, go for it.
So if you were starting a greenfield project right now, it's maybe going live in a couple months, would you run with the React Alpha? Would you run with the React Alpha and use hooks? And a follow-on, would you do it if it was? Would you do it in production right now?
I would not do it in production right now. I would definitely not change all your classes to use functional components and use hooks. The official recommended thing is to, as you create new components, you can try to use hooks, and that's kind of the path. Like, Facebook is going to keep all of its existing class components. It's not going to rewrite the entirety of Facebook to use hooks. Would I recommend that you use it for, no comment? I don't know. If you want. Yeah, it is tempting. I would definitely, if you're not going to use hooks now, which you potentially shouldn't, I would definitely start thinking about more like about how React hooks work, and then write your code in the current API in a hook type way, so that it could make the transition kind of easier. So maybe write it with hooks and then undo it, and write it with class components. I don't know.
Cool.
That's basically what I did. Like, I wrote an app, and then I wrote one with hooks, and then I wrote the other app that was like without hooks. Yeah, that's what I would recommend, I guess.
Thank you.
Quick question: how's your experience with testing been?
With
using
what?
Testing.
Oh, I didn't do any testing. Sorry, I didn't have time. I just was trying to do all the context things. Yeah. However, that being said, in my travels of learning things about hooks, I know that Kent Dodd's testing library, he said it would work exactly the same. The only thing that will work slightly differently is with the use effect. Because use effect is asynchronous, then you'll need to like call the component and then do something to call it again to like make sure that the effect happened, basically. I'm not exactly sure what that will look like, but it shouldn't be a problem. Shouldn't be a problem.
I'm going to basically just say the exact same thing you did. Like Kent C. Dodds, who wrote one of the React hooks tutorials on there, he has a really cool testingjavascript.com tutorial, and his thing is it shouldn't change at all except for her one caveat, because you should be testing implementation, or you should not be testing implementation details. So if you are really interested in how to test this, you can check out his stuff on testing, and it'll kind of get you into a different mindset. If you're used to using like Enzyme or something like that, you can be introduced to React testing library, which I've personally fallen in love with as a way to test React applications. And Will could tell you all about that. He's a huge fan of it as well.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Hilary.
Yes.
Couple quick things as we wrap up. One, again, just to reiterate, links to everything are on the meetup page. There's a link to her slides that has links within them. Yes, so we forgot that at the beginning, dang it. We are looking for speakers in March and beyond, April and beyond, sometime in the future. If you're interested in speaking, whether you've given talks before or you're interested in giving a first talk, please come talk to myself or any of the co-organizers. We would love to have you come give a talk. Trash cans by both doors. Please bring your trash down. And our next event is February 19th right here at Turing. So thank you, everybody, for coming. Have a great night.